The jungle had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop breathing. The last shots had faded somewhere beyond the ridge, replaced by the low buzz of flies circling over what used to be the 136th Regiment of the Imperial Japanese Army. Sergeant Kinji Saito knelt in the dust, hands trembling, helmet cracked down the middle. His uniform was stiff with dried sweat and smoke. Around him, a dozen men stared toward the American lines, a row of shadows behind a wall of bayonets and sunlight. They had fought for 19 days without food. For a week they'd drunk from puddles filled with ash. Now, surrounded on the island of Saipan, there was only one word left in the air: seppuku. For months, their officers had said that Americans took no prisoners, that they burned, tortured, dismembered. That surrender meant eternal shame. The code of Bushido left no room for mercy or survival. Die with honor, the captain had said, before walking into a grenade. Saito could still hear the explosion ringing in his ears. He looked at his hands, empty. No rifle, no blade, just shaking fingers and the taste of iron in his mouth. "I won't let them cut me apart," he whispered in Japanese. The men beside him nodded, some gripping grenades, others pieces of shrapnel sharp enough to open their throats. Then a shout. English. Rough, but not angry. "Drop your weapons. Hands up." For a moment no one moved. The jungle smelled of salt and blood. Then one soldier, the youngest, barely 19, raised his arms. The others followed, slow, disbelieving, as if reaching for a sky they hadn't seen in weeks. Across the clearing, an American Marine stepped forward. His face was streaked with grime, his helmet tilted back. He carried a rifle, but the barrel pointed to the ground. He said something Saito didn't understand. Then he reached into his pack, pulled out a canteen, and held it out. Saito froze. His body screamed trap. The stories, skinning, poison, humiliation, all flashed at once. He waited for the shot, for pain. Instead, a voice behind the Marine said in broken Japanese, "Drink. Water." Sato's breath caught. Slowly, he took the canteen. Cold metal touched his lips. Water ran down his throat, the first clean water in days. He coughed, gasped, then drank again, almost sobbing. The Marine smiled faintly and handed him something else. A dark glass bottle, beads of condensation sliding down its neck. Coca-Cola. Saito had seen one once, in a photograph in a Tokyo newspaper, next to an article about American decadence. Now it was in his hand. He twisted the cap with shaking fingers, heard the hiss of gas, and tasted sugar and bubbles and disbelief. The men around him stared. None could speak. The youngest laughed, a broken, terrified laugh that turned into a sob. One of the Marines tossed a pack of cigarettes toward them. Another pointed toward the road. "Camp," he said. "No shooting. Understand?" Saito nodded. The word echoed in his skull like a wound. No shooting. They began to walk, barefoot, past burned palms and blackened vehicles, through the smell of smoke and oil. Along the roadside lay bodies, friends, enemies, all the same color now. But ahead, trucks waited. Americans helped them climb aboard. Someone threw blankets, someone else passed tin cups of soup. That night, in a makeshift enclosure of barbed wire and canvas, Saito lay awake listening. No one screamed. No one hit them. He saw guards pacing with rifles, but not aiming them. He saw stars above the Pacific for the first time in months. The fear didn't fade easily. Every sound made him flinch. When an American approached with a tray of food, rice, meat, bread, coffee, Saito refused. The Marine shrugged and left it beside him. Hours later, hunger broke him. He ate with his hands, shaking. Across the campfire, the Marine who had given him the Coke was laughing with others. For the first time, Saito realized they looked tired, too. Not monsters, just boys. One strummed a guitar. Another wrote a letter. In his journal, a scrap of notebook he'd hidden in his boot, Saito scratched the only sentence he could form. "I waited for death." Instead, they smiled. Outside the wire, Saipan still burned. Inside, the prisoners whispered to one another, voices full of confusion and shame. Some said it was a trick, that the Americans would turn on them tomorrow. Others just stared into the fire, lost between terror and relief. When dawn came, the smell of bacon drifted through the air. Saito saw an American mess line, metal trays, steam rising, men laughing. Then a guard waved at him. "Breakfast," he said. Saito hesitated. The young Marine grinned and gestured again. Come on, buddy. Eat. The sergeant rose slowly, still barefoot, still uncertain, and walked toward the smell of coffee. He thought of the captain's last words, better to die than surrender. Then he looked at the men behind the counter, handing food to their enemies, and realized something he could not yet name. The war he had believed in was already crumbling, right there between a spoonful of eggs and a stranger's smile. But he didn't know yet that this was only the beginning, that the real shock wasn't survival. It was what came after. Because the next morning, when the sun rose over the Pacific, the same Marine who'd handed him the Coca-Cola called out, "Line up, boys. Breakfast's ready. Meat, bread, and coffee." And no one could understand why. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The first rule they taught him was the line. 2 wooden posts, a strand of barbed wire, and a sentry pacing slow with his rifle cradled across his chest. You stay behind the line, the interpreter said in careful Japanese, and everything stays simple. The sun over Guam was merciless. The camp shimmered, rows of khaki tents breathing heat, a water tower creaking in the distance. Sergeant Kenji Saito stood among 50 prisoners, his uniform torn, skin burned, stomach hollow. They waited for the blow, the punishment, the humiliation, anything that would make sense after surrender. It never came. A corporal with a clipboard called their names, checked the tags tied to their necks, and pointed toward a low wooden building. Saito smelled something impossible, warm food. Steam floated through the doorway, carrying the scent of meat and coffee. His body stiffened. A trick, he thought. They'll make us crawl for it. Instead, a Marine in a stained apron waved him forward. One at a time. Tray cup. His English was slow, but not cruel. Metal clattered, a dented tray filled with stew, rice, bread, green beans. Then a mug, filled to the brim with coffee. The smell hit Saito like a memory from another life. He didn't move. Couldn't. His hands shook around the tray. Behind him, someone whispered, "Eat, they won't hurt us." The Marine tapped the counter, smiling. "Eat up, boys. You're not in the islands anymore." The interpreter repeated it, and for a moment, no one believed him. The first bite of stew scalded Saito's tongue. He winced, then ate faster, almost frantic. The salt, the grease, the heat, all real. Around him, spoons scraped metal. Men swallowed in silence, afraid the miracle might vanish. When a cook passed with a pot and said, "More?" Saito nodded before realizing he'd understood. Outside, the air shimmered with diesel and salt. Guards walked by without shouting. A Marine tossed a pack of cigarettes onto a bench. "Share," he said, miming the motion. The prisoners hesitated, then passed them around. Smoke rose in thin blue lines. Someone laughed, a short, broken sound, but no one silenced him. That evening, under an awning, an officer addressed them through an interpreter. Lieutenant Robert Kane. Young, dust-stained, calm. "You will work," he said. "You will be fed, paid, treated by the Geneva Convention." He paused. "We are not fighting you. We are fighting what made you fight us." No one answered. Across the fence, Marines tossed a baseball, shouting names. The rhythm, the easy laughter, the lazy thwack of the glove, felt like another planet. Saito wrote one line in his hidden notebook that night. "Their discipline has no fear in it." Days passed. Work began, clearing brush, stacking lumber, digging ditches. The guards showed them how to use shovels without splitting palms. "Slow," one said, tapping Sato's shoulder. "Not war here." His tone was patient, almost fatherly. When a man stumbled, a Marine caught his arm instead of hitting him. At dusk, the mess line became a ritual. Trays clanged, rain steamed off the roofs, and the men learned to savor what they once called enemy food. The Americans joked, offered seconds, handed out pie, sweet and alien, made of apples and sugar. Saito bit into it and nearly laughed. A man could die happy from this alone. When rain came hard, the guards pulled them under the eaves and handed out blankets. One Marine stripped off his own poncho to cover an old private who couldn't stop shaking. It was simple, unceremonious kindness, and it disarmed more than any weapon. Then one afternoon, the chaplain arrived. Beside him stood a young Nisei translator, Japanese-American, careful, precise. The chaplain's hands were sunburned, his uniform crisp. He placed a small wooden box on the table. Inside, Envelopes, pencils, paper stamped with the red cross. The translator cleared his throat. "If you wish," he said in perfect Japanese, "you may write a letter home. 1 page. It will be sent through the International Red Cross." The silence that followed was almost physical. A prisoner whispered, "It's a trick." Another stared at the paper like it might explode. Then, slowly, one young soldier stepped forward, the same who had first raised his hands on Saipan. He sat, trembling, pencil in hand. The others watched as he began to write, the lead scratching like a match struck in darkness. "I am alive," he wrote. "They have not harmed us. I can see the sea." Sato's breath caught. He reached for a sheet himself, not knowing why. The paper was thin, the lines faint. He wrote the same words, and as he did, something inside him loosened, something older than fear. Around the room, men bent over their letters. Shoulders shook. Eyes glistened. The chaplain collected the pages carefully, as though each one was a fragile relic. Then he said softly, "If you tell me a name, I will pray for them." No one had heard a voice like that in years. Rough hands covered faces. Air left lungs in broken sounds that weren't quite sobs. Even the guards looked away. Outside, the rain began again, gentle this time. The smell of wet earth drifted through the tent. Saito closed his eyes and saw his mother's face, the way she'd smiled when she'd handed him the sword he'd never used. He didn't know if his letter would reach Japan. Didn't know if mercy could survive an ocean or a censor's blade. But for the first time, he believed that survival might mean more than shame. And when the translator added, almost casually, "You may write again next week," every head lifted at once, as if struck by the same thought. Maybe the war, for them, was ending one word at a time. The voyage took 12 days. The hold smelled of rope, rust, and sweat. When the hatch opened each morning, a square of sky blinded them. They expected jeers when they reached America, but the dock at San Pedro lay quiet, wrapped in fog. MPs in white helmets counted them off and loaded them into trains that rolled east through orange groves, deserts, and green plains that looked too peaceful to belong to a world at war. At a siding in Texas, a Red Cross nurse passed apples through the window slats. No one moved at first, unsure if it was a trick. Then someone took one. The sweetness hit like a memory of home. Their camp sat on flat land that shimmered in the heat. Rows of wooden barracks, a water tower, a flag that snapped in the wind. A sign read simply, "Camp," followed by a name Saito couldn't pronounce. Beyond the wire were cotton fields and a horizon so wide it frightened him. Processing took half a day. Doctors, questions, tags, rules. An American sergeant explained through an interpreter, 3 meals a day, mail on Thursdays, work if you wish, 80 cents. You can buy tobacco or soap. No one believed it. The first work detail went to a nearby farm. The farmer, sunburned and calm, greeted them with a wave. He showed them how to pick cotton without tearing it. At noon his wife brought lemonade with ice that clinked like bells. Saito drank and felt the cold sink into his bones. No one called him enemy. Days turned into rhythm. The mess hall smelled of coffee and steam. The food was plain but real. Guards joked quietly. Some taught them baseball on a dusty field. "Hold it like this," they said, adjusting hands gently on the bat. When a ball flew clean into the sky, men cheered before remembering who they were. In the evenings, a radio played jazz. The sound felt alive, like laughter turned into music. A guard tapped his boot and said, "Benny Goodman." Saito repeated the name as if it were a code word for another world. There was order in everything, but without shouting. Guards gave instructions, not commands. When a man stumbled at work, a Marine helped him up and said, "You okay, buddy?" The word stayed in Sato's ears all night. Buddy. No rank, no fear, just a human voice. He began keeping notes in a small stolen notebook. Here, rebuke comes with reason, not a fist. Here, hunger is solved, not taught. He didn't know if that made America merciful or simply strong enough not to hate. Fights still broke out. Some prisoners spat the word traitor at anyone who smiled at a guard. But the line between hatred and exhaustion blurred more each day. A corporal who once preached Bushido now sat in the shade sharing cigarettes with the same guard he'd cursed. Then came mail call. A chaplain held up a single envelope. "Nagano, Mrs. Saito Tommy," he read. The paper trembled in Sato's hand. His mother's handwriting curved across the page, censored by black lines, but alive. You are not a ghost, she wrote. If you live, live well. The words hit harder than any order he had ever received. Work became routine. They built fences, dug drainage ditches, fixed roofs. Rain came like a wall, then vanished, leaving air sharp and clean. Men laughed at the sight of mud running through their hands. Guards worked beside them, sleeves rolled up, faces tired but kind. One evening, Lieutenant Kane visited. He stood in the doorway, unarmed. "We can't stop the war," he said through the interpreter. "But here, we keep it decent." His calm felt heavier than any speech. He looked each man in the eye before leaving. That night, the barracks smelled of wet wood and soap. The wind rattled the shutters. Someone played a mouth organ near the gate, the tune slow and almost tender. Saito lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing the laughter of guards, the hum of the radio, the steady thump of a baseball somewhere beyond the fence. He thought of his old officer shouting that surrender was shame worse than death. Yet here he was, alive, clean, fed, and treated like a man. Maybe the officer had been wrong. Or maybe the world was. Saito turned onto his side and listened to the far whistle of a train. It sounded, impossibly, like hope. Quiet, steady, moving away but leaving its echo behind. The first sign came at dinner. A single tin tray slid away from the table with a slow scrape of metal on wood. Sergeant Yamada sat still, his face thin, eyes fixed on the floor. "I have no right to eat this," he said in Japanese, voice steady but low. "My regiment died. I should have died with them." No one answered. The mess hall hummed with quiet forks and low English voices, the smell of stew and bread filling the air. Outside, the Texas sun faded to gold over Fort Bliss, but Yamada didn't move. The guard watching the line thought the man was ill until he saw the rigid posture. Not weakness, but refusal. By the next morning, 5 others followed. They sat apart from the group, refusing food, refusing talk. For them, mercy was humiliation. In their minds, they had already failed the only code that mattered, Bushido. Captivity was worse than death. To live, to eat enemy food, to accept kindness, that was dishonor beyond forgiveness. A few Americans tried to reason with them. "You're not prisoners anymore," a medic said through the interpreter. "You're just men who survived." But the words fell like stones into water. Survival itself was the wound. That week, one man from Hiroshima tried to end his life with a shard of tin cut from a can. The guards found him in time. He lived, but after that he spoke to no one. He stared through people, through fences, through sky. The camp doctor wrote in his report, "Body healed, spirit not responding." Lieutenant Kane couldn't understand it. "They have food, shelter, medicine," he told the chaplain. "We saved their lives, and they hate us for it." The chaplain shook his head. "They don't hate you," he said quietly. "They hate the silence left inside them." It became a camp divided. On one side, men laughed, played baseball, and traded cigarettes with guards. On the other, a handful of silent figures sat cross-legged near the barracks wall, unmoving in the sun. They asked not to remove their shackles during roll call, said it made them feel calm. "It reminds us we are not free," one explained to the interpreter. "That is how it should be." At night, Saito could hear them chanting. Not prayers, not words, but low, rhythmic breaths. He'd lie awake on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering which of them was right. The ones who laughed with the Americans, or the ones who still lived by the ghost of the Emperor's code. When rain came, the guards pulled tarps over the camp yard. One of the silent men sat in the downpour, letting the water soak his uniform until it clung to his ribs. "He says it washes away shame," the interpreter whispered. No one stopped him. One evening, Lieutenant Kane walked to the edge of the fence where Yamada sat alone. The sun had gone red behind the guard towers. "Why do you refuse food?" he asked softly, through the interpreter. Yamada didn't look up. "Because you are kind," he said. "And kindness from an enemy is more unbearable than hate." The words hung in the air. Kane stood there a long time, rain dripping off his cap, before he said, "Then maybe that's the hardest part of peace." After that, guards tried smaller gestures. Coffee left on the step, a blanket folded neatly beside a bunk. The men ignored them all. One morning, a corporal set down a plate of scrambled eggs with a slice of toast and said, half joking, "We'll keep doing this until you eat." Yamada stared at it for an hour. Then he took one slow bite, eyes closed. as if reciting a prayer. The guard said nothing. Still, the rift ran deep. The younger prisoners whispered that those who refused food were heroes, true samurai in a world gone soft. Others said they were ghosts clinging to an empire already in ashes. By August, the heat was suffocating. The men's shadows shrank to thin cuts in the dust. Each evening, the same scene repeated. A ball game on one side, silence on the other. The sound of laughter mixed with the quiet rattle of prayer beads. Saito found himself between both worlds, eating American food, reading American books, but still bowing to the emptiness that came with the word defeat. Some nights he thought of home and couldn't remember the shape of his mother's face. The Americans noticed the change too. They no longer saw defiance as hatred, only pain that had nowhere to go. The camp chaplain wrote in his log, "These men were raised to see surrender as moral death. They live now in bodies their beliefs cannot forgive." Then, one afternoon, the gate opened. A convoy arrived, jeeps, dust, and an officer with silver stars on his collar. A general. He shook hands with the camp commander, then addressed the prisoners through a translator. His voice carried across the yard, calm, deliberate. "The war in Europe is over," he said. "Germany has fallen." The men listened, eyes blank. Then he added, almost gently, "And soon, Japan will face the same fate." A ripple of disbelief spread through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Lies." Another spat into the dirt. Even those who'd accepted kindness stood frozen. For a moment, the camp felt like a held breath. Hundreds of men suspended between the world they'd lost and the one that hadn't yet arrived. When the general left, the silence stayed. Yamada broke it first. "If the emperor falls," he whispered, "then everything we were falls with him." Saito turned toward the horizon, where the flag still waved above the fence. He wanted to ask what would happen when the war inside them ended, or if it ever could. But before he could speak, the siren at the gate sounded again, calling the men to assembly. The interpreter's face was pale. He held a new message in his hand, straight from Washington. A message that, by the next morning, would tear the meaning of victory apart. The morning was unbearably still. Even the guards seemed uneasy, their voices low, their boots soft on the gravel. Then the generators went silent, the first real silence the camp had known in months. The loudspeakers crackled. An interpreter climbed onto a crate in the yard, a sheet of paper trembling in his hand. He hesitated, swallowed, and began to read. "The emperor has spoken. Hostilities are to cease. Japan has surrendered." For a moment, no one moved. The words drifted into the dry Texas air like dust, unreal and weightless. Then came the murmur, confused, broken Japanese, one question echoing through the ranks. "What did he say?" The interpreter repeated it, louder this time, his voice shaking. "The emperor has ordered all fighting to stop." A low gasp spread through the prisoners. Some fell to their knees, others stood rigid, eyes wide with disbelief. A sergeant whispered, "Impossible. His Majesty cannot yield." Another covered his face with both hands, shoulders shaking. A few stared at the sky as if expecting thunder. But there was only wind. No one cheered. No one smiled. The war, the purpose that had defined every breath, every sacrifice, had ended, and with it, the world they knew. Lieutenant Kane stepped forward, hat in hand. "It's over," he said quietly, through the translator. "You're going home." But his words sounded hollow. The men just stared at him, as if home were a word without meaning. Some of them began to cry, not from relief, but from something darker. Others stood perfectly still, lips moving in silent prayers for forgiveness. One young prisoner muttered, "We are already dead." Saito watched them, feeling his heart twist. He remembered Yamada's vow never to eat, his eyes that refused light. Now that vow seemed almost logical, a way to avoid living through this moment. The emperor had been more than a man. He had been a living god. And now that god had told them to stop fighting. In the barracks that night, the men sat on their bunks, motionless. The radio played the recording again, the faint, distant voice of Hirohito, speaking through static. Even translated, the words sounded ghostly. "To all our subjects, bear the unbearable, endure the unendurable." Some began to weep quietly. Others clutched at their uniforms, their medals, their memories, trying to hold on to an identity that had just vanished. The guards didn't know what to do. They walked slower, spoke softer, almost deferentially. One Marine scribbled in his diary that night, "When the interpreter said the war is over, I thought they'd cheer. But they just looked down, like the ground itself had betrayed them." By morning, a few prisoners had written requests. "Do not send us home." They said Japan would never accept them. Prisoners were still considered cowards, disgraced. "Better to stay here," one note read, "where we are treated as men." The camp chaplain read the message and shook his head. "They've lost twice," he whispered. "First their empire, now their place in it." Lieutenant Kane tried to speak to them again. He told them the war's end meant life, that the world would rebuild. But even as he spoke, he knew they weren't listening. Their eyes were turned inward, to a shattered vision of honor, of duty, of who they were supposed to be. When the stars and stripes were lowered that evening, a strange thing happened. A few prisoners, unprompted, stood and bowed slightly toward the flag. No salute, no ceremony, just a quiet, human gesture of respect. The guards didn't move, afraid to break it. As dusk fell, the camp was quieter than ever. The air carried the smell of dust and coffee and something else, grief without language. Later that night, Saito walked alone to the fence. The lights hummed softly overhead. Beyond the wires stretched endless land, as empty and foreign as the future itself. He thought of home, of narrow streets, of his mother's handwriting, of a country he no longer recognized. In that moment, he realized the Emperor's voice had done more than end a war. It had broken a spell. Behind him, Kane spoke to the chaplain, his tone subdued. "I think they finally understand," he said. "Understand what?" the chaplain asked. "That we didn't beat them with bombs," Kane said. "We beat them with how we treated them." The chaplain looked toward the rows of barracks, where men lay awake under the strange peace of Texas. And for the first time in 4 years, both sides felt the same thing. Not victory, not defeat, but the unbearable quiet of survival. When morning came, Saito found a note on the mess table, left by a guard. Just 2 words, written in neat block letters. "Be well." He folded it carefully, placed it in his notebook, and looked at the rising sun over the fence. Light without fire, warmth without war. The ship that carried them home left San Francisco at dawn. The harbor was silent except for gulls and the creak of ropes. Saito stood at the railing in a worn American jacket, staring at the city fading behind fog. The water was calm, too calm, as if the ocean itself didn't know which side had won. He had thought he'd feel joy, or at least relief. Instead, he felt hollow, like a man walking away from his own shadow. Around him, other former prisoners leaned against the rails, quiet, their faces unreadable. One whispered, "I don't know if I'm going home, or leaving it forever." When Japan finally appeared through the mist, it wasn't the country they remembered. The docks at Yokohama were shattered, the skyline full of ruins and scaffolds. Children watched them from the pier with wide, cautious eyes. No one cheered. No flags waved. Just a cold wind and the sound of boots on wood. Officials in gray uniforms checked names, stamped papers, and moved on without expression. To them, these men were ghosts returned from shame. One officer muttered, "You surrendered. You should not have come back." That night, Saito sat in a makeshift dormitory, rows of cots under a tin roof, and stared at the bowl of rice in front of him. It was the first Japanese meal he'd had in years, but he could taste nothing. Around him, men spoke in whispers, each realizing that the mercy they'd found in enemy hands had no place here. Weeks later, he returned to his village near Nagasaki. The streets were quiet, the houses patched with scrap wood. His mother stood in the doorway, smaller than he remembered. She didn't cry. She only bowed once and said, "You lived." He wanted to explain, to tell her about the camp, about the food, the books, the strange kindness of guards who shared cigarettes and called him buddy. But the words caught in his throat. How could he describe that the enemy had treated him more like a man than his own empire ever had? Instead, he helped repair roofs, plowed fields, tried to disappear into the rhythm of survival. Yet every time he saw a bottle of Coca-Cola in the hands of an American soldier from the occupation forces, something stirred, a memory of that first cold taste in Saipan, when he'd realized that everything he'd been taught about monsters was wrong. Years later, Saito became a teacher. He never spoke about the war, but his students noticed a small object on his desk, a flattened bottle cap, polished smooth. When asked, he would only smile faintly and say, "It came from a time when the world was on fire, and someone offered me water." Other former prisoners tried to write down their memories. One described it simply: "They defeated us with humanity." Another, who'd once sworn never to eat enemy food, opened a small restaurant near Tokyo that served American-style sandwiches. On the wall hung a faded photograph: Japanese prisoners playing baseball in Texas, grinning under the sun. In the United States, newspapers printed their stories. "We fed our enemies," one headline read. "And in doing so, we changed them." Politicians called it proof of America's moral victory. But for the men who'd lived it, it was more personal. A quiet revolution that began not with a treaty or a bomb, but with a meal shared across fear. Sato's last letter, found years later among his papers, was short. "When I first drank Coca-Cola, I thought it was poison. When it cooled my throat, I realized it was peace. They showed me that the war inside a man can end before the one outside does." He died in 1972, a modest teacher who still bowed to the rising sun each morning, not as to a god, but to light, something that belonged to everyone. In an interview decades later, his former guard, Robert Kane, was asked what he remembered most. He smiled softly. "The first time I handed that boy a bottle, he flinched like it was a weapon," he said. Then he took a sip and smiled. "I guess that's when the war ended for both of us." The ocean between their countries stayed vast, but the distance between two people, one with a rifle, one with empty hands, had vanished long ago. Because war doesn't end when the last shot is fired. It ends the moment an enemy tastes kindness and realizes it isn't poison.